Hey, so today's episode, we were going to just have as one bigger episode, but we've decided to split it into two parts. So this is the first part of the episode, and then next week we will be releasing the second part of the episode just to give a more complete conversation. So hope you enjoy.
Welcome to Robot Unicorn. We are so glad that you are here. As always, let's start the show with a question from Scott.
Let's get right into it. Today's episode is on puberty, and I feel like I have a ton of questions, and I also asked listeners through Instagram to list out what they want to hear from you. And I've sort of created this list of questions in order of hopefully something useful for people in the end. And what's interesting, actually, I found very few people asked for specifically how do you talk about like this.
Like one specific thing.
Like how do you talk to your girls about periods? And how do you talk to your, like, there was no specific thing that they wanted us to tell them. It was more about how do we even have this conversation and feel comfortable doing so? And like, when should we do it? All right. So Jess, as a parent and a therapist, have there been any unexpected challenges that you have seen in having the puberty discussion in our home versus the advice you've given online and through therapy clients?
I think for the most part, because I have taught sexual education for so many years and body safety for so many years, a lot of it does come really natural to me. I feel like for the most part, I have been quite confident to have these conversations with our kids, and we can go through why. I think the one thing that did and does still bring up some feelings in me is having the sex talk. That's something that I've had to reflect on. Like, why do you feel so uncomfortable to have this conversation? And I think the biggest reason that in my reflections I've found is that I want to keep my kids innocent for so long. And there is something that I have this feeling of that just comes up for me of like, well, when I have these conversations, am I going to take that away? And I know that's a fear that so many parents have, and a fear that we will address
Honestly, there
today.
was quite a few questions around that or comments around that. Like, how do you have these discussions and then also keep your children from feeling, first of all, like all of a sudden they're bad kids because they start to have feelings when they have puberty, and like different feelings and urges and that kind of stuff. And it seems like parents are worried about their children feeling like they're no longer good. And it's because of what they've taught them. The innocence is no longer there.
And I would say that's less of my worry, because I think the way that we'll talk about sex with our kids, it won't make them question their goodness. I think I'm more so worried of like, now you're going to view this world and you're going to understand things that you didn't understand before. You know what I mean? Like, you're going to understand, oh, when I walk past a store that sells bras and there's a girl in a sexy bra, like, you're going to start to make these connections that right now it's just a girl in a bra, right?
Oh, so pretty.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Like, for our little girls, we walk past a lingerie store and they just think it's the most beautiful thing they've ever seen.
So pink and purple.
So pink. Oh, Mom, you should get them all. You know, like, they just think it's the most beautiful thing in the world.
Yeah.
And the more I reflect on that, it's like I just want to hold on to their littleness and preserve that. And we'll talk about this, but I have to have these conversations with them in order to preserve their innocence. Because if we don't, as parents, take the lead on that, they will find out these things. They will start to understand why the bras are not just bras, but a whole sexual thing, right? But I want them to know that from me first. Right. And that helps protect their innocence. So that does help me when I'm starting to feel that way.
Another common theme, I guess, that I saw in the questions we were receiving was that parents felt like there was this delicate balance or dance they had to play between providing information, being informative, and not overwhelming their children. Because it's like you said, it's opening their eyes to something that they didn't realize existed before, and now they can kind of see it everywhere. So from your experience, are there subtle signs in your child that most children will show that suggest they're ready to even have the conversation about puberty and the sex talk and all that kind of stuff? And again, I know it's not like a one done type situation, but are there subtle signs where they're ready for the next stage? And what even are those stages?
Yeah. So can I just back us up just for a minute?
Sure.
Just in case people haven't heard our other episodes where we talk about this. But my approach to the sex talk, to the puberty talk, anything related to body safety is small conversations that happen over time. So historically, if you're listening to this, when you had the sex talk, if you even had it when you were a kid, it's probably like a one-time, super awkward conversation with your parent. Unless your parents were a little bit more, progressive or understanding of these topics, it probably was like a one-time conversation you had. It was super awkward, if you even had it, and that was it. And that's what we're trying to avoid doing. There will still be probably that one kind of more awkward for you conversation that we'll talk about that, the actual sex talk conversation. But what we want to do is have small conversations with your child over time. And so that starts in infancy and toddlerhood and preschool age. You're telling them about their body parts in a very neutral way. They're learning about it just like they would an elbow or their hand. And you start having these conversations over time. Something even like the period conversation, I think a lot of parents feel like there has to be this one big conversation that we have before a child has their period. I would like to see that as an evolving conversation over time, right? Maybe your child finds pads in the bathroom and you just have a very casual conversation about what it is.
Yeah.
And slowly, as they get older, closer to the age that they might actually have their period, right? So you asked about signs of readiness. There's two different signs of readiness. There's the sign of readiness that your child's asking questions related to the topic. So if they're old enough to understand enough to ask a question, we want to be able to give them a factual answer. I think parents often are afraid. So let's say our daughter were to say, "Daddy, what's a period?" They know what a period is. But if they were to ask you that and you feel so uncomfortable, you're like, "Oh, yeah, that's not something for you to know." And you just shut it down. Your child knows enough to ask you the question. That tells us that they deserve an answer. Now, you don't have to explain every single thing about a period to them. We like to think of it like a small factual answer, something to give them because they'll stay curious. So that if they're asking you and you don't answer, then they'll go ask a friend. And they'll go ask someone else and they'll get an answer, but it might not be factual.
Right.
And if you don't have an answer in the moment, you might say, "Wow, that's a really great question. Tell me a little bit where it's coming from," because it's coming from somewhere, right? They heard something, they saw something. Let the child answer that.
Yep.
Right?
That's a good idea. I wouldn't necessarily think by default to do that.
Yeah, that should be your first response. So if your child said, "Daddy, what's sex?" "Oh, tell me more. Where did you hear this word?" "Oh, well, I heard about it on a show that you were watching." "Oh, okay. And what do you think it might mean?" Right? So first, ask them
Get curious.
Get curious. Ask them where they heard about it. Ask them what they think it means so that you can correct anything, right? Because they might say, "Oh, I think it means this." And it might totally be wrong. So once you have all the information, then if you feel comfortable in the moment answering, you can. If you feel like you need a little bit of time to just sit with that and come up with the answer, you might say, "I am going to answer your question, but I just need a little bit of time and I will come back to you." The other thing is that sometimes if you have multiple kids in the home, like we do, kids might ask in front of their very little siblings questions like, "Why is there naked people I saw on the bus?" And maybe you're not quite ready to have that conversation with your 4-year-old who's overhearing, but you want to for sure have that conversation with your 11-year-old who's talking to you about it. It's okay to say like, "Hey, yes, we'll definitely have this conversation, just not right now." But within the day, maybe at bedtime or something, you circle back to it.
Yeah. Okay. So can we go back though to
Sorry.
what are the signs that they're ready to be given more information? So one you said is that they're just asking questions.
Yes.
But I feel like some kids won't do that.
So we have appropriate conversations per age.
Okay.
And we also have the question asking. So if your child's asking a question, they're ready to hear an answer. Maybe not the full answer, but they're ready to hear.
Because I can imagine like a 3-4-year-old, like our 4-year-old, she has or would ask, like, "Where did babies come from? How did the baby get in family member, whatever, aunt's belly?" How are you going to have that kind of conversation with that? Like, they're asking, but are they ready to receive all of the information?
Exactly. So where do babies come from? There's varying stages of answering that question, kind of depending on your child's readiness and your child's age.
Yeah.
So if you have a 4-year-old ask that question, "Where do babies come from?" I did answer our child and she asked, "Oh, in order to make a baby, you need one part from dad." Like in that scenario, it was dad and mom, right? So you need one part from one parent, you need one part from another parent, and they swirl together and they're put inside of a mommy's uterus, and that helps to make a baby. And that was enough for her to be like, oh, okay, so you need something from one parent, something from another parent. They get mixed together and it makes a baby. Okay.
And you would use the term uterus?
I would use the term uterus. But our kids know, you may not know this, but our kids know what a uterus is.
It doesn't surprise me that that is the case.
So
I feel like I have not been a part of that conversation then.
No? Well, I just had that conversation like a couple days ago when we were on the way to see a newborn baby.
Oh, okay. So I wasn't there when... Okay. Yeah.
But again, that goes back to we're having all of these small conversations, right? So I've already told our kids that the uterus is the squishy part underneath your belly button inside your body, right? And I've already told them that when they were growing inside of me, they grew in my uterus. My uterus got bigger and bigger. I've already told them that babies come out of a vagina or they come out of a small incision that's made in a belly. So I've already given them all of those pieces of information just slowly over time, like when they ask about questions about when I was pregnant with them, right? And just very casually, I've had those conversations with them. I've told them about the uterus. I've told them about birth. So when they asked, how does a baby get inside? It wasn't too alarming to them to hear, oh, you need one part from one parent and one part from another parent. I mean, I literally labeled them. I was like, you need an egg from one parent and a sperm from another parent, and they get swirled together and go inside the uterus, and that's how a baby's made. So now they have that. Again, it's those small conversations over time that will evolve so that eventually when you're having, let's say, the actual sex talk, then we're talking about how those parts come together to form a baby.
Yeah.
But they already have the other information. That makes it a lot less overwhelming for them because we're like, there's building blocks in order to have the conversation eventually about puberty or sex or whatever, because it's all been talked to them. Like they've been slowly growing their knowledge over time.
Right. Okay. So just to reiterate, you're saying they're either asking the question and you give age appropriate answers.
Yep.
Or they reach a certain age and you are the
Yes.
one, as the parent, providing them with the information, like having that talk with them.
Exactly.
I mean, I can see that. I have a few questions about that, but we'll get to that towards the end. I looked up a bunch of research articles before this episode too, and it seems well documented that children today, for myriad reasons, are going through puberty much earlier than previous generations. So I was kind of wondering, like, how does this impact the way you have talked to parents about having the discussions and like counsel parents when they want to discuss puberty? And how is that different from, let's say, what previous generations have had to do? I mean, that's assuming that previous generations really had much of any of this discussion.
Yeah, I think we have a lot more information out there now about how to have the discussion. From my talks with people of how they learned about puberty, I mean, there's varying things. There's like, I was talking to someone and she just said, oh, yeah, well, my mom said, yeah, you'll get your period just like your sisters, probably same time. And that was the whole discussion. And she had to learn everything through like watching her sisters and stuff like that. You know, and then I've heard from people that, oh, my mom just gave me a book. And it was just on my bed one day and I had to read the book and I learned everything I could, but there was no conversation. The book just appeared on my bed and then that was that. So that was a lot of what the conversation was, right? I think parents wanted to have the conversations, but they didn't have the information as to how to have those conversations.
Right.
I think now we have more information and we're able to talk about this more with our kids, right? So in terms of children entering puberty earlier, I can't speak to the biology of that, but that is something that's proven that we're seeing girls have their periods earlier and earlier. That does mean that we have to have those conversations earlier.
Yeah, it seems like based on the articles, a bunch of scientific publications I was reading, and they were saying that it's several years younger than previous generations.
I've heard from many followers, because I've been talking about this over on Instagram, that their children are, having their periods for the first time as young as age 8. And so that does impact us as parents because we need to then have those conversations earlier because we want our children to be prepared for when and if that happens to not only themselves, but their peers.
Right.
Right. So let's say that happens to their best friend at school and they have no idea what that is. That can still be really concerning and confusing for a child.
Well, and I think my initial thought is the fact that kids are going through puberty earlier.
Yep.
Like, are they even developmentally ready to have the discussion? Because their body is going through things that maybe their brain just is not able to comprehend yet.
Yeah.
Fully.
I think that's a really important thing to talk about. And then not only are they going through puberty earlier, but they are being exposed to things earlier as well. Right. So,
well, because you're even talking about having age appropriate discussions with your children But let's say our daughter, who is 8, has her period. Like, is she fully ready to have the conversations that you would have otherwise said are more meant for like an 11-year-old?
Like developmentally ready.
Yeah, developmentally ready for that.
It's so tricky, right? Because developmentally, maybe not. But also, if we don't, like, it's the balance, right? Like, so you developmentally, she's 8. Her job should be to be playing, to be having fun, to be curious about things, right? We might start seeing the curiosity developing around age 8 around things like, oh, okay, hold on. Why do parents like kissing? Or wait, why is this happening on this show, right? They might start to pick up on those things naturally around age 8. But because of the media, that is so easily accessible to children. And children are having devices. They're having access to YouTube. They're having access to pornography a lot easier than ever before, right? Especially, let's say, if they're on a school bus with older kids, they have older siblings. It's much more likely that they're going to be exposed to that kind of thing at an earlier age. It used to be the first exposure to pornography was usually age 11. So then we were trying to have sex talks with kids like 9 to 10, so that was before age 11. But newer reports are showing that kids' first exposure to pornography is getting earlier and earlier. So it's becoming more that 8 to 9 age.
Yeah, right.
So developmentally, are they ready for that conversation? Possibly not. Do we need to have that conversation a little bit earlier? Yes, we do, because their likelihood of being exposed is so much higher. So it kind of sucks. We're in a not so great position. Now we can have that conversation about sex related things, but again, it's an evolving conversation, right? So you're not going to go straight into sex, but you can talk to your 8-year-old about safe and unsafe pictures and images. You can talk to them about what to do if someone's showing them or they see something that makes them feel scared or nervous or unsure. You can talk to them about how it's not okay for them to be seeing videos of people naked, so that you at least have that framework laid before you get into the sex conversation. So again, that's like a smaller conversation that you have first.
Yeah, okay. I see that. But that goes back to that original main theme that I saw, where people were saying there's this delicate balance between overwhelming or informing your kids.
Yeah.
And it feels like we almost have to err on the side of, we sort of have to overwhelm them a little bit. Like, that's the feeling I have, at least. So we almost have to overwhelm them with information that they shouldn't have to know, but it's important in order to actually protect them from the real world.
Yeah, exactly. There is a balance. But in terms of the word overwhelm, I just want to talk about the way we have these conversations with kids, because I think it can feel really scary to a parent. I know it's scary to me too, that your child might be exposed to something when they're at school or at a cousin's house, that kind of thing. And so because we're scared, we might rush through these discussions. We might like quickly have them with their kids because we want them to have all the information. And that will overwhelm them.
I guess my initial feeling or thought is that maybe it's more overwhelming for me than it is for them.
Exactly.
Right? Like, I am slightly overwhelmed by the idea of having the discussion and talking to them about it, but maybe it's like everything else. We have factual discussions with them about everything else. So why is this any different?
And if a child feels so safe when you're having those discussions, so don't have it in a heated moment. Don't have it when you're feeling anxious about it in your own body, right? Like, I picture this, like the time when our child's most likely to talk to us, I feel like there's 2 times. One is in the car.
Yep.
So I feel like I have great discussions with her when I'm in the car, and I can have trickier discussions because we're not necessarily face to face. And she'll always tell me about her friend struggles or blah, 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 whatever's going on at school when we're in the car. So a drive is a nice time to have that discussion. The other nice time is at bedtime. Like, I feel like she's always open, wants to chat with us about everything.
She doesn't want us to leave.
Yeah, she wants to stay awake. So what I imagine is creating an environment that's so safe. And in terms of the overwhelming, again, go back to the small conversations. So the first time you have the conversation, you're just talking about pictures, right? Not a big deal. Hey, just so you know, it's possible that you might see a picture of someone without clothes on. And if that time ever were to happen, I want you to let us know right away, or let your teacher know, right? It could happen in class. People have access to devices. Sometimes it does happen at school or on the bus. So if it happens, please just let us know, or let your teacher know right away. Done. Doing it in a safe and cozy way. And your child's like, okay. Like, I trust my parents, like, and I even say to parents, like, you're going to teach your kids about road safety. You're going to teach your kids about safety in all sorts of areas. This is just another way you're going to teach your kids about safety, right? And you're going to do it in a calm way. And then the next time you have a conversation, maybe a couple weeks later, you give them a little bit more details, or even like months later. And so I think we can have the conversations in a way that's not a total like brain dump on your child of everything they need to know at once. You do it slowly and you do it in a safe way. And I think it will probably feel more overwhelming to you than to them. Because to them, it's facts that you're teaching them, unless you come in with a whole bunch of emotion and fear. Then they'll feed off that fear and they'll know it's a scary thing.
So that, though, you're saying do it when you don't feel overwhelmed by the idea of the conversation. But I think a lot of parents would say,
I'm
no
always going to
matter
feel
when
overwhelmed.
I have the discussion, it's going to be overwhelming.
So a couple of things to that, because yes, I agree. I think for a lot of people, because of our own insecurity and the way that we were raised and the way that we were talked to about these things, like we personally feel so uncomfortable. So I guess two things. One, try and role play it out. You love that idea.
I hate that idea.
I still get people responding to our other episode like, let's do more role plays. Scott needs to get over it. But anyway, I do think like if you have a co-parent or even your friends, like talk out what that conversation might look like and how it might evolve before you're in the moment with your child, just so that you're not stumbling over your words. Like you've practiced, you know what you're going to say. And then second, try and fake it a little bit. You might in your body feel like 100 alarm bells are going off, but you're not going to let your child know that. They need to know that you're the leader. They can trust you and they can come and talk to you about this. But if you come in, you're like, oh yeah, there's like some really scary stuff online. And like, I don't want you to see anything scary. And it's so scary. And if you saw it, like it would be really bad for you. So please don't see it. And your child's going to be like, whoa, this is way too overwhelming for my parent. Like I can't come to them with this. So there is sometimes in parenting, like to be the leader, we need to kind of fake being the leader, even if we don't feel it inside, and then release those feelings to your friends and be like, oh my word, I just had this conversation. It was so stressful, but don't talk to your kids about that.
I think being married to you has made me far more open about having these discussions. Like I don't know by default I would have been like that, except for the fact that you are. So I think that's been quite helpful. I think for a lot of parents, both are likely kind of awkward about it.
Yes.
My concern is something we'll talk about at the very end of this. But I think what you said makes sense. And there's a lot of shame around the discussion of puberty. And even I've noticed in our short discussion here so far, it almost feels like puberty and sex are inextricably linked together. And we go to the very
we focus on the sex.
That's all we focus on. Yeah. Meanwhile, I feel like it's so much more than that. And yes, that is a part of it.
Yeah.
And the urges are a part of it. And body development is a part of it.
Yeah. So I'll say we just finished creating our puberty toolkit. And this was a discussion that we had a lot during that toolkit, right? Because we're like, do we include sex in that or is that a different thing? We decided to not include sex in that toolkit because we wanted to have this toolkit lay all the framework for having those sex discussions maybe next. So this is like your first step.
Right.
And we didn't have it in there because we didn't want parents to only focus on the sex piece.
It sort of feels like, yes, that is an important discussion, but that's sort of the, not final discussion, but that's towards the end of the whole puberty discussion itself.
Yeah.
You talk about your changing body and the things that you'll start to feel, and your voice might change a little bit, and you're going to grow certain body parts that you don't have currently. And
let's talk about how big that is for kids.
Yeah.
Right? Like imagine being, I don't know, a 10-year-old child. We'll go with girl, but we could talk about boys too. And all of a sudden your breasts start developing. It's sore, it hurts. I have these lumps on my chest, right? And maybe it's exciting.
Our girls have said it's so gross and they do not want them.
Our girls are grossed out by it, the idea of that happening to them, right? So that's big. And all of a sudden you have hair growing from parts that never grew hair before. Your whole body's changing. And the reason we didn't want to include sex in the puberty toolkit is because we're like, let's not bypass how big this is for kids. Like we need to talk about the puberty too, right? Like your breasts are developing. For boys, like your voice is changing. It's cracking all the time, right? Like that's a big deal. And you have hair and you have these new urges and, now I have my period and now I'm getting more erections than I ever have and I don't know how to deal with them. And now I have wet dreams. Like puberty is a huge time. And I think historically, a lot of our parents didn't know how to talk to us about all these different changes that were going on in our body, right? So let's not only focus on sex. And I think to your point of sex being the big conversation, if you're having puberty conversations with your child, right, you're starting to talk about erections and when that happens. And then you're starting to talk about periods and boobs growing and all of these different things. that sets the stage for having the sex talk in a lot easier of a way, because now you've already talked about all these other things as well.
Have you noticed patterns in parents? Like, let's say for me, I knew nothing really about puberty. I feel like in school we learned nothing. It seems like something we should have learned more of. I certainly don't know what girls were going through growing up, right? So my experience is limited. And I feel like there was, again, this sense of shame that was always kind of went hand in hand with any talk of puberty. It's like this thing you should kind of feel a bit ashamed of, and like these urges you should feel a bit ashamed of. And
because it's talked hush hush, right?
yeah.
Like every single kid is going through this in your class at the exact same time. You're all going through puberty, but it's like, shh, okay. So we're going to just take the boys out and have a conversation with them. Like, at least this was my experience. We weren't in the same class. But like for me as a girl, we never learned about what was going on for the boys. And we only exclusively learned about our periods, nothing else in school for me, right? Nothing about all the other body changes that was happening and the urges and sex. And like, we didn't learn about any of that. So what that does is like when we're saying it in secret and hushed voices, it's like, this is shameful. Like this is going to happen to your body, but it's shameful. So like, don't talk about it and don't share how you're feeling and keep it a secret. So now you're a parent and you're trying to teach it and you're like, wait, I have to have this conversation with my daughters? Like, I'm not allowed to know about periods.
Well, I feel like our parents' generation was kind of the same, right? Like they also wouldn't say we're the most comfortable having these discussions. So
yeah. I will say my mom did a good job. Like she had the period discussion with me.
Oh yeah, okay.
In a good way. Yep. That was probably like ahead of her time to have that conversation in that way. But even for her, I'm sure that was awkward because I'm sure she didn't get that conversation. And she didn't have anyone to teach her how to have that conversation with her kids. So I'm sure even the fact that she had that with me was probably very uncomfortable at the time, I would imagine. But thank goodness she did, because I was the first kid in my class to have my period and I knew about it ahead of time. So that was good.
do you find that there's challenges that, like, I would say for us, the fact that you are so open about it and you have done sex ed courses and courses on puberty and all that and taught people about this, you've sort of forced me to become less uncomfortable with the idea of having these discussions. But I wonder about, let's say if you're a couple and you have two vastly different experiences growing up and you want to handle the discussion differently. Like, how do you overcome that gap?
That's a conversation I think you and your partner definitely need to be having, especially earlier on.
But I can imagine it would be easy to disagree on how to approach the conversations, though.
I see what you're saying. Like, it'd be easy to have different, like, one partner's like, no, like,
They don't need to know this.
They don't need to know that.
Not yet. Or
And the other partner's like, no, I want to teach him. Yeah, that would be hard. And I can't necessarily tell you what to do except for have the conversations, like, and even things like you're already listening to this podcast. So that's a really good step, right? And you might not agree.
Right, but that could be the one person that actually wants to have the conversation.
Right, and the other partner's not listening to the podcast and doesn't want to.
Yeah.
I think it kind of comes to all things parenting. Like, can there be some things that you can negotiate on and some things that are non-negotiable, right? Like, for example, the safe pictures thing. Like, to me, that should be a non-negotiable that every parent should teach to their child as they're entering the school age. Your child needs to know about safe and unsafe pictures. That's non-negotiable to me, because we know how likely it is that they might be exposed to something that's unsafe, and you want them to come to you. Things like teaching your daughter, at least your daughter, about a period. I would be teaching my sons about it too. I always joke to Scott, that's one of the reasons I am sad to not have a son, because I was looking forward to teaching them all these things. But at least with your daughter, you're teaching them about periods far before they're going to have their period. I would say that should be a non-negotiable, right? So there's certain things that are non-negotiable. If you feel so deeply uncomfortable to teach your son about periods, I mean, I think reflect on why you feel so uncomfortable about that. But at least you're teaching that to your daughter, right? So come up with things that, like, they have to know. And also ask yourself, like, if you're the skeptic listening, who do you want your child to turn to when they get exposed to this type of content?
Yeah.
And that's what I would always say when I was teaching this to parents. Who do you want them to go to? Because if they don't know that you know about sex, and you know about unsafe pictures, and you know about periods, if they don't know that you know that, they might just assume you don't know about those things, or it's way too shameful and bad to talk to you about it. And they will turn to Google. They will turn to their friends. They will talk to other people to find out their answers. So I guess choose who you want your child to go to. But for us and for the parents I teach, I want kids to go to their parent so that they can get accurate information and feel safe if something ever were to happen to them.
Right. Do you feel like we've ever had that kind of disagreement on what to teach our kids?
I don't think
Or like, has there been
so.
anything that you've learned from our journey doing this together?
I feel like more so you definitely came into it a lot more uncomfortable, right? Like I remember even when we first got together, and if I had wanted you to get like tampons or something, I feel like you would have been so awkward about that. Like I can't like remember a time, but like you definitely weren't the boyfriend who was like, oh, no problem, I'll go out and get you tampons. Like you probably would have been like, no way, I can't be seen. And I feel like I remember having that conversation, like, what, you think people are going to think you're buying it for yourself? Like what's the fear here? I don't get it.
Yeah.
So you definitely weren't that.
See, now I can just buy it on Amazon and put it in gift packaging if I really need to,
So I think even things like that, like, and for you, like,
No, I wouldn't be bothered by that.
and nor should you be, because you're going to have 3 daughters and this is going to be a big thing in your life,
yeah.
right? But even things like, do you know how to put a pad onto underwear?
Nope.
So things like that I feel like, because you were not the boy who learned these things, this is why I do think it's important to teach this to your sons. Because your sons are going to have friends who are girls. Your sons are going to have friends who are girls who maybe their period leaks out of their pants. And I would love for your son to be the one who says, yeah, here's a sweater so you can cover your bum, right? Or so you don't have to show that, right? Like, I think it is important. And it's important to teach our daughters about things like erections and things like that, because they're going to see it and they're going to hear about it in class. You know how many times I heard about that type of comment or joke in class and I like didn't know what people were talking about, so I felt so awkward and ashamed. I'd rather our kids just know, and like, hey, if they accidentally see a kid at a pool party with an erection or something, they just kind of walk away, not make it a big deal. Because the more, even as we were creating the puberty toolkit, the more we're reading about erections and like learning about them, it's like that's going to happen all the time when you're a young boy going through puberty, right? You can't really control it.
Yep.
And so I'd rather our girls know what that is from us and know like, okay, don't make it a big deal, just like walk away, on top of all the other body safety and consent stuff. I'd rather they know that from us than have to try and figure out what to do in that awkward situation themselves if they're at a pool party or something like that. So anyway, all that to say is I think something that maybe we've not been on different pages about, but like, because I've taught this for years and years, like saying the word erection does not faze me at all. Saying the word penis doesn't faze me. I feel like there's still like an awkwardness to you that I can even tell right now as I'm talking about these things.
No, I just want to laugh.
Yeah, right.
That goes back to my childhood for sure, because me and the other boys in the class would always laugh at those kind of words. And
yeah, I'm sure. You were probably the voice making everybody else uncomfortable in the class because you were like dying of laughter about it.
We were always laughing about it.
Picture that. So I think for you, I mean, we've had the period conversations, but we're not like in that stage yet. Even learning things like how to put a pad on underwear in case I'm not there, and one of our daughters has their period for the first time. Like I would like for you to know how to coach them through how to do those types of things. Mm-hmm. And that's not something you've ever had to do, or like even like open a pad, right? So I would say for parents who are not so comfortable with this, get yourself comfortable.
I think I've used a pad before as a bandage when I cut myself really badly.
Yeah, I think you did.
But
otherwise, like you would have never looked at a tampon.
No, I don't even know if I would know what it looks like, to be honest.
Right. And you've
has a tail or something on it, right?
Yeah, a string.
A string?
Tail.
Yeah, tail. It looks like a mouse or something.
Okay. Get yourself comfortable with those kind of things. And even you can do it with your kids, like with your daughter, like if you're teaching. One of the things that we suggest for puberty too, especially as your kids enter into that age where their peers might be starting to have their period, is to like make a little kit, just have it in your backpack, just in case you need it. So maybe if you're the uncomfortable parent, maybe you're the one helping them make that kit, right? But I would say that's kind of the only issue that we've had. You've mostly taken my lead, I think, and respected that I've taught this for many years, so that I hopefully know what I'm talking about.
Well, I feel like the level at which you understand the topic is far greater than what I understand, so I'm not going to interject when I don't know anything about it.
Well, and I want to share this. The reason that I got into teaching this to begin with, body safety, sexual health, like all that kind of stuff, is because I was working with adults with intellectual disabilities and children, and they were never taught this information.
And they were pulled out of sex ed, right?
Yes. So the youth that I was teaching this to, the special education classroom would be pulled out of these discussions, and they would not learn about consent and sex and periods and all of this stuff, even though this was still happening to them. And the rates of abuse for people who were not taught this information were so much higher. Like there's a lot of research to back that up, that having these discussions with your children, whether or not they have an intellectual disability, that just happened to be the population I was teaching this to, having these discussions decreases their rates of abuse and vulnerability to abuse. And that's like a highly researched thing. So that's why I became so passionate about having these conversations and teaching, especially to people who were not otherwise going to be taught. And we could see just even like anecdotally in the teaching that we were doing and the stories that we were hearing, that it was saving people from abusive situations. And I did so much research on this in my undergrad. Like I kind of thought that this would be the area that I fully specialized in. And now, of course, it's like one of the areas that I specialize in. But I do feel really passionately about teaching this to kids because I want to decrease their vulnerability to abuse. For me, that's how I got over being awkward about talking about it, because I'm like, it's so important to talk about it with our kids and give them this information. It's more than just like they know what a pad is. Like the more we can be the trusted leader and have these conversations, the more we're actually protecting our kids down the road. And that's why it's so important to me to have these conversations and to teach you how to have these conversations with your kids too.
Mm-hmm. That I think is a good segue into vocabulary and the terms that we use, because you have said that helps reduce the rates of abuse. Mm-hmm. But it seems like people asking questions and people commenting on Instagram, on posts and all that, they feel it's, again, one of those situations where you're taking away a child's innocence by teaching them these words that maybe we just feel shame or discomfort around them. Do you think there's anything to be said about the vocabulary? Yes, you should teach your children the right words for their body parts and all that stuff. But is having discussions about, like if you were to use like a slang term for your penis or vagina or whatever, like if you use a slang term, is that really that bad?
I mean, why do you have to use a slang term, I guess is my question.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I think a major reason for people being hung up on vocabulary, because that's really what it is, I think, is just words, is their discomfort around the whole subject, like we've been talking about.
Exactly.
There's a lot of shame around puberty and sex. So on one hand, you're saying, well, I guess not on one hand, you are saying that teaching them the right terms is better.
Yep.
But do you think there's anything wrong with teaching like slang? I don't know. To me, it just kind of seems like we're splitting hairs. Like if you're going to teach them, just teach them. And if you're not using the exact right term for a body part, does that matter so much?
I say to parents, like at least make sure that they know what their body part is called. So don't only teach them the slang term.
Okay.
You know what I mean? But I think my issue with slang terms, and you're right, it might just be splitting hairs, is like if we're using a slang term with our kids because we're so deeply uncomfortable with saying the word penis or saying the word vagina, we are in turn passing down our shame to our kids. And I just feel like, why? Like there's no point in my head. Like when I used to teach adults this stuff, we would have a chart, like we'd have like a big chart and we just write down every slang word that you know. And the chart would be like pages and pages and pages of slang words. And sometimes the adults I was teaching didn't even know the proper name. They only knew the slang terms. That really is when I started to think about it. I'm like, okay, if you're 30 and you don't know the word vulva and you don't know that that's your own body part and you feel so deeply uncomfortable when I say it that I see you like looking away like, oof, this is so shameful. And it's just your own body part. That's really helpful actually to know what it is in case it's itchy, or what if your child has a yeast infection or a UTI or there's something itchy down there and they want to tell you. It's important that they know the word and they're not like my cookie, you know?
Right.
And like even worst case, if something happens, there's also research on this, that like a predator is much less likely to abuse someone who knows the anatomically correct name. Like, so if they've heard you, and oftentimes predators
Is that what it is though? It's the fact that they know. It must be that they have just had that discussion with. That
tells them that they've had this discussion with their parents.
Right.
Right.
But is it the fact that it's not the fact that they just know
no, I guess that's part of.
Yeah.
But there was interviews with, I don't know, I'll have to find the actual article maybe and link it here. But there was something where it was like interviews with child sex predators. And they're saying something along the lines of like, if they knew that the child knew the words, then that told them that they had had conversations with their parents and like they were less likely to be victims. Because oftentimes the people who are the abusers are in the child's life, right? They're
Right.
a family member, they're a family friend. So they would have probably known that the parent's having this kind of conversation. Anyway, that's a separate topic.
So to me, it sounds like what you are saying is it's worth sort of just getting over the discomfort and having the discussion with the correct names of the body parts.
Yeah, I mean, that would be my recommendation. Like, I don't know if you ever played this when you were a kid, but sometimes as a kid, my friends would
penis game?
want to play the penis game.
Yeah.
Okay,
Oh, yeah.
I wasn't sure if that was like
Oh,
a
yeah.
niche game that we
You do
played.
that.
No, that's like
start by whispering it and then start getting louder and louder until the teacher gets upset with you.
Oh my word, I never did that at school.
Oh, really? No.
That was a school game for you?
Yeah, 100%.
Oh my word. No, the penis game, I think we played it like under the bridge by my parents' house.
Really?
You, of course, played that in class. That adds up.
100%.
That checks out.
Me and my buddies would be sitting in the back of class just slowly saying it louder and louder and louder.
And guess what? Kids are going to be less likely to say have the penis game if they have heard the word penis since they're 2 years old and don't think it's a big deal. Anyway, it's a separate topic. But
So they won't think it's a funny word?
maybe they'll still find it funny.
don't know.
But it's going to be less funny if you've heard it.
Yeah. No, I know.
You know? Anyway, for people like you, it'll always be funny. But so play that game in your own home. Like look in the mirror, just say it 100 times. The word's going to lose, you don't think it's going to lose its funniness?
No.
Okay, well, never mind then. Scratch that game.
I
But I do think the more you say it, the more comfortable you feel with it.
Yes. True.
I remember-
I think for me, you know me, I like just putting out comments there that just create a slight amount of discomfort or leaving the silence for a little longer than is comfortable.
Yeah.
So it makes sense that.
Yeah, I mean, there's reasons why you like that. But anyway, back to the questions.
Okay. Yeah. Do you think there are any other deeper anxieties around the use of like the correct terms though? Because I know like one of the main things that people say is that your child is losing their innocence. And
Yeah.
you kind of said that at the beginning too with the sex talk.
Yeah, I think that's the main anxiety people have. Is like, well, I don't want them to not be innocent. And like 2-year-old children shouldn't know the word vulva, right? So I guess we have to reflect on our definition of innocence. And again, I've wanted to say this whole episode, we view things through our adult brains, right? And our adult brains know about things like sex. And they like we think about things from a more sexual point of view because we're adults.
Do we though?
Well,
I don't know. Like it's not like it's an all-consuming thing.
no, but for example, I had a dad reach out to me once and he said, Jess, my son is having erections and I'm really concerned about him. You know, he's only 3. And that is the example of what I mean is like we're viewing it from our adult brains and we're viewing that as like that's like a dirty, terrible sexual thing. Oh my goodness, my 3-year-old's like this, sexual person already. When in reality, that's a very normal thing to happen to a 3-year-old when they get excited or when something happens or whatever. Like that's very normal. But that dad was viewing it as dirty and bad because of his own lens that he takes to it. And so we need to remember that our kids are coming into these conversations with that lens. If we tell them a vulva is a vulva and a vagina is a vagina and a penis is a penis, that's not a dirty thing to them. That's not taking away their innocence. It's simply just naming a body part. So that's why, again, we want to be mindful of our own biases and our own lens in which we view these conversations. Because for the most part, that's not going to take away their innocence so long as we don't project that onto them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Yeah.
I know, that's the way I see our girls too. Like one of them, we were at the water park and all of a sudden was naked and standing over top of a water jet
Yeah.
and was looking at me like, Daddy, do you want to try this? Like it feels so good.
Right. Of course it does.
And we're like,
It's just natural.
it's like the most innocent thing that they could do because they're like, oh, this actually feels kind of nice.
Yes.
And like, Dad, you should try this. Like,
Yeah. Well, that's another question I get asked, like, oh my goodness, like my child's touching themselves, or they're like touching their vulva, or they're touching their penis, or they're putting their vulva under like the bath water when it's coming out, or whatever. And again, like we're viewing that from our adult brains, right? Like, oh my goodness, like they're masturbating, that's so dirty and gross for a child to do, but we got to think about it from their brain. And for them, it's just like, oh, that feels interesting. Oh, that feels different. Oh, I didn't know it would feel that way. It's just an interesting, good feeling to them. That's it. Mm-hmm. And you can still set boundaries. Like, yeah, you're not allowed to stand naked over a water jet at the splash pad. Like, we don't do that because that's your private body and it's your private parts and blah, blah, blah. You can have that conversation with your kid. You can tell your kid, like, no, when grandma and papa are over, you can't pull down your pants and touch your penis. in the living room. That's something that you can do in the bathroom, but that's not something that we do in public, right? In our body safety toolkit, we talk about public and private behaviors, and so you can have that conversation without shaming them and making it like a dirty sexual thing.
Yeah. And then they'll have a hard time having that conversation if they ever have kids in the future too, because they feel shame around it. Yep, I understand. Well, thanks for listening to today's episode on puberty. We'll be back next week with part 2 of this episode. Hope you'll be back. We really enjoyed having this discussion and can't wait for the second part of this.
Hey friends, thank you so much for listening to today's episode. We are glad that you are here. If you enjoyed today's episode and found it interesting, we'd really appreciate it if you'd leave a rating and a review. Scott and I actually sit down together and read them all. A 5-star rating helps us share our podcast and get these important messages out there. Thank you so much for listening, and we can't wait to talk to you again next time.